In the mid-1600s, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was one of the largest nations in Europe, with a population of 11 million people. Poland was famed for its winged hussars that were some of the most elite cavalry units in the world. However, Poland was coming to the end of what would be remembered as the Polish Golden Age and would now enter a period of weakness and decline. By 1795, only 150 years later, Poland had been wiped off the map, divided between the neighbouring powers of Prussia, Russia and Austria. For the next 123 years, there existed a country named Poland only in the hearts and memories of ethnic Poles that longed to one day again be free. The first partition of Poland came in 1772, but the seeds of decline were sown long before that. Over time, the government had become increasingly dysfunctional and corrupt, and by the early 1600s, Poland was held hostage by its nobility. The nobles controlled parliament and the elected king. Much of their power came from the liberum veto, a rule which meant that any new law could be vetoed by a single member of parliament. This made Poland hugely vulnerable to the meddling of foreign European powers. Hostile nations could easily bribe Polish nobles to block any new laws. Poland's political system was paralyzed. Poland had also been weakened by war. In 1648, the Cossacks of modern-day Ukraine rose up and fought to free themselves of Polish influence. The Cossacks defeated Poland at the Battle of Bato, and in the aftermath of the battle, they massacred 8,000 prisoners of war. Those men were some of Poland's best soldiers. Then, 3 years later, Swedish King Charles X invaded and claimed the Polish throne. The invading Swedes devastated the country and took enormous quantities of loot back to Sweden. Warsaw, the capital, was destroyed and saw its population fall by 90%. The scale of the destruction was so great that it came to be known as the Deluge. Then Russia entered the war and took Poland's territory east of the Dnieper River. Poland had been severely weakened, but it limped on and tried to rebuild and recover. Unfortunately, only a few decades later, Sweden would invade again during the Great Northern War. The Polish king, Augustus II, briefly lost power and was only able to regain the throne with help from Russia. Over the next decades, Poland fell more and more under the influence of Russia, and by the late 1700s, it was a shadow of its former self, a vassal state controlled by the Russian puppet master Nikolai Repnin. This loss of power and prestige caused huge resentment amongst the Polish nobility. They were angry about Poland's decline and wanted to see it regain its place in Europe. In 1768, the nobles met at the fortress of Bar and vowed to fight for Polish sovereignty. This small group of nobles came to be known as the Bar Confederation and declared war on Russia. However, the uprising quickly began to fail. Within months, Bar itself had fallen and the rebels fled into Ottoman-held Moldavia. Russia followed the fleeing rebels across the border and occupied Moldavia and Wallachia. With Poland embroiled in civil war, the rulers of Austria, Prussia and Russia were thinking of ways to take advantage of their weak neighbour. Plans were drawn up for the occupation of vast swathes of Poland. The plan was, in part, a way to prevent war between themselves. Russia's occupation of Moldavia and Wallachia was hugely aggravating to Austria, since they had long coveted the region. Austria was even considering going to war. In order to prevent war, it was decided that Moldavia and Wallachia would remain under Ottoman control. Then, to satisfy their lust for territorial expansion, the three powers would carve off large chunks of Poland. In 1772, the Agreement of Partition was signed in Vienna. Austrian, Prussian and Russian troops simultaneously entered Poland and occupied the agreed-upon territories. Prussia took the smallest share, occupying much of the north coast. This was a major success for Prussia, allowing it to unite the two parts of its territory. Russia and Austria both took large chunks of the east and south. The first partition cost Poland 1/3 of its territory and population. Unfortunately, Poland was in no position to resist. The three foreign powers had occupied Warsaw and were threatening to destroy the city if Poland didn't submit. The Polish parliament was forced to sign away all claim to the occupied territories. In this diminished form, Poland limped on with an uncertain future. It was clear that to have any hope of revival, Poland would need to implement significant reforms. A constitution was drawn up that sought to end the political gridlock and regain the nation's strength. The constitution was one of the most enlightened of its time, giving the vote to the bourgeoisie and establishing the separation of the three branches of government. Most importantly of all, the new constitution would end the liberum veto, the rule which had allowed any single member of parliament to block all new legislation. The constitution was implemented in 1791 and immediately drew hostility from Poland's neighbours. They benefited from the weakness of Poland and were determined to maintain the status quo. Russian Tsar Catherine the Great was particularly furious about the adoption of the constitution, since it would reduce Russia's influence. In the words of the Russian Chancellor, "The worst possible news has arrived from Warsaw. The Polish king has become almost sovereign." This was not going to be tolerated by Tsar Catherine. She decided that Russia would invade and overturn the new constitution. In Poland, some of the nobles actually supported the Russian invasion. Known as the Targowica Confederation, they were opposed to the new constitution and hoped that Russia would re-establish the privileges that the nobility had enjoyed in centuries prior. On the 18th of May 1792, Russian forces entered Poland, beginning what would come to be known as the War in Defense of the Constitution. The Polish army was outnumbered almost 3-1, and its ranks were filled with inexperienced soldiers. Nevertheless, the Polish men fought fiercely. The Russians were advancing, but the Poles were able to inflict significant casualties and even win some battles. Poland's most talented commander was Tadeusz Kościuszko. He achieved some astonishing feats, managing to delay a force 5 times the size of his at the Battle of Dubienka. Kościuszko was optimistic that the Poles would be able to defeat the invading Russians if they fought hard enough. With enough determination, they might be able to exhaust the Russian forces and prevent them from taking Warsaw. However, Kościuszko's efforts were about to be undermined by the king, Stanislaus II. The king, believing that the war was lost, called for a ceasefire and ended the Polish resistance. Today, most historians view this as a disastrous mistake. The Polish army hadn't suffered any major defeat and was fit to continue fighting. There is a reasonable chance that the Polish army would have been able to hold off the Russians, but it was thwarted by the king before it had the chance. The Polish military leaders were incensed by the decision. Kościuszko let loose his frustration and resigned his position. Prince Poniatowski, another general, even considered abducting the king and continuing the resistance against his orders. This is all the more astonishing because Poniatowski was a nephew of King Stanislaus. Neither the king nor the pro-Russian Targowica Confederation expected what came next. With Poland defeated, Prussia and Russia decided that they would partition it again and annex even more territory. Prussia doubled what it had gained in the west, while Russia took an enormous chunk of territory in the east. Poland was now a third of the size that it had been only 20 years before, a rump state clinging on for survival. However, there were those that still wished to fight. The Polish population hated the occupying forces, and in early 1794, nationwide riots broke out. For Tadeusz Kościuszko, this offered one last hope. He galvanized the local people and gave them the spirit to rise up again and fight for Poland. He took command of the armed forces and declared a nationwide uprising against the foreign occupiers. This would come to be known as the Kościuszko Uprising. It was Poland's last chance. The army of Kościuszko was ill-equipped and trained. Some of his men were just peasants armed with a scythe. Even so, Kościuszko was initially successful, winning the Battle of Rakłowice. One of the peasant soldiers, named Wojciech Głowacki, would become a national hero when he captured a Russian cannon by putting out the fuse with his hat. This victory was a huge morale boost for the Poles, and men flocked to join the fight. More good news came from Warsaw, where the Russian garrison of 5,000 soldiers was overwhelmed and ejected from the city. Poland had its capital city back. With victory beginning to seem possible, Kościuszko promised that he would abolish serfdom should the uprising succeed. That led even more men to join his army, which was now 15,000 strong. However, just as the uprising was building momentum, Prussia sent 17,000 troops to help the Russians, and the joint force began to overwhelm the rebels. Kościuszko met the foreign army at Szczecin, and the odds were against him. The enemy had twice as many men and 5 times as many cannons. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Polish rebels didn't stand a chance. They were forced to withdraw and cede control of the south of Poland. Then, in October, the rebels suffered disaster when Kosciuszko himself was wounded and captured at the Battle of Maciej-Jowicy. With the uprising now leaderless, the situation was dire for the rebels. They retreated to Warsaw and prepared to make their last stand. That last stand would take place on November the 4th, 1794. At 5 in the morning, the Russian army began an all-out assault on the city, taking the rebels by surprise. Their focus was the district of Praga on the eastern side of the Vistula River. The sound of cannon fire thundered through the air as the Russian army advanced into the city. After 4 hours of brutal hand-to-hand fighting, Praga fell. The Russian army then went on a murderous rampage. Tens of thousands of civilians were tortured, raped, and murdered. The Polish resistance had been crushed. In the third and final partition of Poland, Russia, Prussia and Austria divided up the carcass of the devastated nation. Poland had been wiped off the map. For the next 123 years, the nation of Poland remained an idea, a dream in the minds of ethnic Poles all over the world. Thousands of Poles fled to other European nations, and while there, they created poetry and art about their desire to return. There were numerous uprisings in the 1800s, notably the November Uprising of 1830. However, they will all be crushed. Poland would re-emerge onto the world map in 1918, when Germany, Austria and Russia were defeated in the First World War. Only 20 years later, it would be occupied again, this time by Nazi Germany and Communist Russia. It was Hitler's invasion of Poland that led Britain and France to declare war on Germany, starting the Second World War. Poland would lose 6 million people in the war, including 3 million Jews to the Holocaust. With the end of the Second World War, Poland would again fall under the control of Russia as part of the Soviet bloc. It would be with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, more than 200 years after the first partition, that Poland would become once again a sovereign nation.